The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Razor like a knife through bone. Staff Sergeant Martinez pressed his headset closer, straining to catch the transmission through the static that danced across the frequency like angry spirits. Razor Control, this is Viper 6-1. We are heavily engaged, I repeat, heavily engaged. Enemy contact from 3 directions, requesting immediate close air support, over. The voice belonged to Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, leading a 12-man SEAL team deep in the Kunar Province mountains. What should have been a routine extraction had gone sideways faster than a grenade with a pulled pin. The Taliban had been waiting, as if they'd known exactly when and where the Americans would come. Martinez's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up the grid coordinates. The SEALs were pinned down in a valley that locals called the Devil's Throat, a narrow gorge where the mountain walls rose like cathedral spires on either side, creating a natural kill box. Enemy positions were dug into the high ground, raining down fire from concealed fighting positions that had probably taken months to prepare. Viper 6-1, this is Razor Control, Martinez responded, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his stomach. Copy your situation. We have fast movers inbound, ETA 12 minutes. But 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. The SEALs were running low on ammunition, and the enemy was closing in. Martinez could hear the desperation creeping into Morrison's voice during each transmission, the way seasoned warriors sound when they're calculating odds they don't like. Then came the transmission that changed everything. Razor Control, Warthog 2-7 requesting permission to engage. I'm 3 minutes out and ready to make some noise. Martinez frowned at his screen. According to his flight manifest, there weren't supposed to be any A-10 Thunderbolts in the area. The closest Warthogs were back at Bagram, a 40-minute flight away. He quickly cross-referenced call signs and his confusion deepened. Warthog 2-7 wasn't even supposed to exist. The call sign had been retired 6 months ago after a controversial incident that the brass preferred not to discuss. Yet here it was, crackling through his headset like a ghost from the Air Force's carefully buried past. Warthog 2-7, this is Razor Control, Martinez said carefully. Confirm your call sign and pilot identification. The response came back with the kind of calm confidence that only came from someone who had stared death in the face and made it blink first. Razor Control, Warthog 2-7, Captain Mikhailova Katia, serial number 774921885. And gentlemen, those SEALs are about to have a very good day. The radio fell silent for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Morrison's voice cut through the static, tight with disbelief. Captain Katia Mikhailova had been flying combat missions when most of these SEALs were still figuring out which end of a rifle to hold. Born in Moscow to a Red Army colonel who defected during the final days of the Soviet Union, she'd grown up speaking 3 languages and dreaming of American skis. Her father had told her stories of MiG-29s and Su-27, but it was the ugly, ungainly A-10 Thunderbolt II that captured her imagination. The Air Force Academy had tried to break her. 4 years of being the only Russian-born cadet in her class, enduring whispered questions about her loyalty and her accent that never quite disappeared no matter how hard she tried. They called her Red behind her back, sometimes to her face. She responded by graduating 3rd in her class and earning her wings with the kind of precision that made instructors forget her last name ended in Ova. But it was in the skis over Afghanistan that Katia Mikhailova became legend. Flying the A-10 came as naturally to her as breathing. The massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon became an extension of her will, its distinctive BRRRT sound the last thing insurgents heard before their positions turned to dust and memories. Ground troops started requesting her specifically, passing along stories of impossible saves and precision strikes that defied physics. Then came Helmand Province, a convoy ambush. Friendly forces scattered across a compound, with enemy fighters mixed among civilian structures, the kind of scenario that turned veteran pilots into nervous wrecks. Katia had threaded the needle, eliminating the ambush while keeping collateral damage to zero. It should have been a textbook case study in close air support excellence. Instead, it became a political nightmare when CNN got hold of footage showing her aircraft's cannon rounds landing within meters of an Afghan school. Never mind that the school had been empty for months. Never mind that her precision had saved 30 American lives. The optics were devastating, and the Air Force needed a scapegoat. They'd grounded her, buried her in desk assignments, and quietly suggested she might be happier in the civilian world. The unofficial message was clear. Russian-born pilots who attracted media attention were liability the service couldn't afford. But tonight, with 12 SEALs trapped in the devil's throat and enemy positions dug in like ticks, none of that political calculus mattered. Katia had borrowed an A-10 from the maintenance bay, filed a flight plan that would take her nowhere near Kunar province, and then turned north into the mountains where American warriors needed her. Now, as she approached the valley at 450 knots, she could see the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness below like deadly fireflies. The SEAL's infrared strobes showed up clearly on her night vision system, tiny beacons of hope in an ocean of violence. Viper 6-1, Warthog 2-7 has you in sight, she transmitted, her Russian accent making the words sound like poetry and death rolled into one. Describe your target. The relief in Morrison's voice was palpable. Warthog 2-7, we've got heavy machine gun positions on the north wall, Grid Papa Quebec 745298. They're dug in deep, and they've got us pinned down hard. Katia's eyes swept the valley through her targeting pod, identifying the enemy positions with the kind of tactical brilliance that came from hundreds of combat sorties. She could see the SEALs huddled behind inadequate cover, their situation deteriorating by the minute. Enemy fighters were moving to flank them, creeping through the rocks like hunting wolves. Copy Viper 6-1, I see them. Keep your heads down, boys. Mama Bear is coming to the party. The A-10 banked hard left, its twin engines screaming as Katia lined up her first attack run. Below her, enemy tracers reached up like grasping fingers, trying to swat her from the sky. She ignored them with the kind of cold focus that separated professional warriors from weekend heroes. The GAU-8 cannon spooled up with a mechanical whine that would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrifying. Katia's finger found the trigger, and for one crystalline moment, the entire valley held its breath. Then the Warthog spoke. The sound of the GAU-8 Avenger firing was unlike anything else in the world. Not quite an explosion, not quite a buzz saw, but something that seemed to tear reality itself in half. 30mm depleted uranium rounds poured from the 7-barrel cannon at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, each one capable of punching through tank armor. The northern machine gun position simply ceased to exist. One moment it was a source of deadly fire, the next it was a smoking crater filled with twisted metal and silence. The enemy fighters who had been preparing to flank the SEALs suddenly found themselves dealing with a nightmare they hadn't signed up for. But Katia wasn't finished. As she pulled out of her first attack run, she could see secondary positions opening up, trying to engage her aircraft with everything from AK-47s to RPGs. The valley had become a shooting gallery, and she was the main attraction. Viper 6-1, that's one down, she transmitted calmly, as if she were discussing the weather instead of delivering death from above. I'm seeing movement on your eastern flank. Looks like a squad-sized element trying to work around behind you. Morrison's response was clipped and professional. Roger that, 2-7. We're tracking them, but we can't engage without exposing our position. Understood, I'll take care of them. Stay down. They came around for its second pass, this time approaching from the east. Katia could see the enemy fighters clearly now, A dozen men moving through the rocks with the confidence of hunters who thought they had their prey cornered. They were about to learn that confidence was a luxury they couldn't afford. The cannon spoke again, its voice echoing off the valley walls like the judgment of an angry god. The flanking element disappeared in a cloud of dust and flying rock, their tactical advantage evaporating along with their lives. But the enemy wasn't finished. As Katia pulled up from her second attack run, she heard the distinctive whoosh of a surface-to-air missile launch. Her threat warning system screamed to life, filling her headset with electronic alarms that meant someone down there had managed to acquire a lock on her aircraft. Missile launch, she called out, more for the benefit of the SEALs than for any air traffic controller. There wasn't time for evasive maneuvers, not at this altitude and airspeed. Instead, she did something that would have gotten her court-martialed if it hadn't been so effective. She dove straight at the missile site. The A-10 Grail was an old Soviet weapon, but still deadly if it found its target. Katia could see its smoke trail racing toward her aircraft, a white line against the star-filled sky that represented death in its purest form. But she'd grown up hearing stories of Soviet pilots who had faced similar weapons, and she knew the missile's weaknesses better than most. At the last possible second, she released a spread of flares and pulled into a vertical climb that pushed the A-10's airframe to its absolute limits. The G-forces tried to crush her into her ejection seat, but she held on, watching through tears of physical pain as the missile chased her flares instead of her engines. The explosion lit up the valley like daylight, but Katia was already rolling into her third attack run. The missile position had revealed itself with its launch, and now it was time to pay the price for that mistake. This time, she didn't use the cannon. Instead, she selected one of her AGM-65 Maverick missiles, a weapon designed specifically for taking out hardened targets. The missile's seeker head locked onto the enemy position, and Katia squeezed the trigger. "Fox 3, she called out, using the standard brevity code for a missile launch. The Maverick streaked down from the sky like a guided lightning bolt, its 125-pound warhead turning the missile position into a brief, brilliant flower of destruction. The secondary explosions that followed suggested the enemy had been storing ammunition in the same location, a tactical error that proved fatal. Morrison's voice came through the radio, and for the first time that night it carried something that might have been hope. "Warthog 2-7, that was beautiful work. Enemy fire has decreased significantly. We might actually get out of here alive." But Katia wasn't ready to declare victory yet. Her targeting pod was showing movement in at least 3 more locations, and she could see muzzle flashes that indicated the enemy still had fight left in them. The SEALs might be catching their breath, but the battle was far from over. "Don't celebrate yet, Viper 6-1. I'm seeing more activity on your western approach. Looks like they're bringing up reinforcements." As if to punctuate her words, a new voice broke into the radio traffic. Enemy communications, broadcast in the clear on an unsecured frequency. The Taliban commander was rallying his forces, calling for every available fighter to converge on the trapped Americans. Katia understood enough Pashto to catch the gist of the transmission, and what she heard made her blood run cold. The enemy wasn't just trying to eliminate the SEAL team anymore. They were using the Americans as bait, hopping to draw and rescue aircraft that they could shoot down for propaganda value. She was flying directly into a trap that had been laid specifically for her. The realization should have sent her retreating to safer airspace, calling for backup and letting someone else handle the increasingly dangerous situation. That would have been the smart play, the politically safe choice that would keep her out of another controversy. Instead, Katia Mikhailova did what she had always done when faced with impossible odds and American lives hanging in the balance. She pressed the attack. "Viper 6-1, be advised I'm tracking multiple enemy reinforcements moving to your location. They're trying to box you in, but they made one mistake. Morrison's response was tense. "What's that, 2-7?" Kadia's smile would have been visible in the darkness if anyone had been close enough to see it. It was the kind of expression that her instructors at the Air Force Academy would have recognized immediately, the look of a predator who had just spotted prey. "They brought a knife to a gunfight, and I brought a warthog." The A-10 banked into a wide circle, giving Kadia a comprehensive view of the tactical situation below. The SEALs were still pinned in the valley floor, but their position was more defensible now that she'd eliminated the high-ground threats. The real danger was coming from the reinforcements streaming toward the valley from 3 directions. Through her night vision system, she could count at least 40 enemy fighters moving through the mountains. They were organized, well-armed, and clearly operating under competent leadership. Under normal circumstances, a single aircraft against those odds would have been suicide. But the A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't a normal aircraft, and Captain Kadia Mikhailova wasn't a normal pilot. She selected her remaining Maverick missiles and began identifying targets. The enemy vehicles were moving in loose convoy formation, using the mountain roads that offered the fastest route to the valley. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, believing that darkness and terrain would protect them from air attack. They were about to learn otherwise. The first Maverick took out the lead vehicle in the western column, blocking the narrow road and trapping the rest of the convoy in a kill zone. The second missile eliminated a technical truck mounting a heavy machine gun, the kind of weapon that could chew through SEALs and their equipment in seconds. But missiles were expensive and limited. Kadia had brought 12, and she'd already expended half of them. For the sustained fight that was developing, she would need to rely on the A-10's most famous weapon. The GAU-8 cannon held 1,174 rounds of 30 ammunition, each round capable of devastating anything short of a main battle tank. Kadia had practiced conservation of ammunition until it became second nature, but tonight she would need every single round. The cannon's rate of fire was adjustable, and she selected the lower setting to make her ammunition last longer. Even at the reduced rate, the weapon was still devastatingly effective against soft targets like trucks and personnel. Her fourth attack run came from the north, targeting the eastern reinforcement column. The cannon spoke in controlled bursts, each burst precisely aimed and devastatingly effective. Vehicles exploded, fighters scattered, and what had been an organized assault began to look more like a rout. But the enemy adapted quickly. As Kadia came around for her fifth pass, she found herself flying into a coordinated anti-aircraft trap. Small arms fire rose from a dozen positions, creating a cone of lead that filled the air around her aircraft. The A-10 was built to absorb damage, but no aircraft was invulnerable. Kadia felt the impacts as bullets struck her wings and fuselage, and warning lights began illuminating her instrument panel. Nothing critical yet, but the enemy was learning to shoot at where she was going to be, not where she had been. Morrison's voice cut through her tactical calculations. "Warthog 2-7, you're taking heavy fire. We can see tracers all around you." "Roger that, Viper 6-1. This old bird has taken worse and kept flying. How's your ammunition situation?" The pause before Morrison answered told her everything she needed to know. "We're running low, 2-7. Maybe 10 minutes of sustained fire left, and that's if we're conservative." 10 minutes? In a firefight like this, 10 minutes might as well have been 10 seconds. Kadia checked her own ammunition counter and did the mental math. She had enough cannon rounds for maybe 6 more attack runs, depending on how long each engagement lasted. It wasn't enough. Even if she eliminated every target she could see, there would still be enemy fighters in the valley when the SEALs ran out of ammunition, and more reinforcements were probably already on the way. But mathematics had never been Kadia's strongest subject anyway. What she understood was loyalty and courage, and the unbreakable bond between warriors who faced death together. The SEALs down in that valley had never questioned her accent or her birthplace. They'd never cared about political controversies or media coverage. They'd simply called for help, and she had answered. That was enough. Viper 6-1, Warthog 2-7. I want you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once. Morrison's response was immediate. Go ahead, 2-7. When I make my next pass, I'm going to strafe along the entire northern rim. As soon as you hear my cannon stop firing, I want you and your boys to move. Don't look back. Don't stop to help the wounded, just move. Head southeast toward the extraction point, and don't stop until you reach friendly lines. Negative 2-7. We don't abandon friendlies, and we're not leaving without you providing top cover. Kadia's laugh carried no humor, only the kind of grim acceptance that came with making peace with impossible odds. Chief, I've got maybe 3 minutes of ammunition left, and there are 50 Taliban fighters between you and safety. The math doesn't work. Then we'll die together. No, Kadia said firmly, and suddenly her voice carried the authority of someone who had made command decisions in impossible situations. No, you won't. You're going to live, you're going to go home to your families, and you're going to tell them about the Russian girl who learned to fly American jets. The radio fell silent except for the static that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken words. Below in the valley, 12 American warriors prepared to make their final stand. Above them, a woman who had spent her entire career proving she belonged was about to prove it one last time. Kadia pushed the A-10 into a steep dive, lining up for what she knew would be her final attack run. The enemy positions were clearly visible now, muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars across the valley rim. She could see fighters moving to surround the SEAL's position, closing in for the kill. The targeting system locked onto the largest concentration of enemy forces, and Kadia's finger found the cannon trigger. For a moment that seemed to last forever, she thought about the path that had brought her to this point. A little girl in Moscow, dreaming of American skis. A cadet at the Air Force Academy, enduring whispered questions about her loyalty. A pilot in Afghanistan, earning the respect of ground troops who cared more about results than birthplaces. And now this, a valley in the Hindu Kush, where the daughter of a Soviet defector was about to give everything for a dozen Americans she'd never met. The GAU-8 cannon spoke for the last time, its voice carrying across the mountains like thunder. The northern rim erupted in explosions as 30 rounds found their targets, buying the SEALs precious seconds to begin their escape. But as Kadia pulled out of her final dive, she heard the sound she'd been dreading. Her left engine was losing power, RPM dropping rapidly as damage from the intense ground fire finally took its toll. The A-10 could fly on one engine, but not with the kind of performance she needed to stay ahead of the surface-to-air missiles that were already launching. Warning lights illuminated her cockpit like a Christmas tree, each one representing a system that was failing or had already failed. Hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems flickering, flight controls becoming increasingly sluggish. The aircraft was dying around her, but it was still flying, and as long as it was flying, she could still fight. Morrison's voice crackled through her headset, tight with emotion. Warthog 2-7, we're moving. Your cannon run gave us the opening we needed. Good, Kadia replied, wrestling with controls that were becoming less responsive by the second. Keep moving, don't stop. And Chief. Yes, 2-7. Tell them back at base that Captain Mikhailova sends her regards. The second engine began to fail as she spoke, its temperature gauges climbing into the red zone. The A-10 was tough, built to absorb incredible amounts of damage and keep flying, but even the legendary Warthog had its limits. Kadia had perhaps 60 seconds before she would be forced to eject. 60 seconds to make sure the SEALs had enough of a head start to reach safety. 60 seconds to ensure that her sacrifice wouldn't be wasted. She pointed the dying aircraft toward the largest concentration of enemy forces and pushed the throttles forward one last time. The engines responded with a dying roar, giving her just enough speed for one final act of defiance. The SEALs had disappeared into the darkness, following the route she'd given them toward the extraction point. They were moving fast, using the confusion caused by her attacks to slip away from the enemy forces that had been moments away from overrunning their position. Behind them, an A-10 Thunderbolt II painted a line of fire across the Afghan sky, its pilot fighting to squeeze every last second of flight time from an aircraft that should have been a smoking crater on the valley floor. When the ejection seat fired, launching Katia into the thin mountain air, the explosion lit up the valley like daylight. The A-10 had given everything it had, and so had its pilot. But 12 American warriors were running toward safety, and that made everything else worthwhile. The parachute opened with a sharp crack, and Captain Katia Mikhailova drifted down toward enemy territory, wondering if she would live to see another sunrise. Below her, the wreckage of her aircraft burned like a beacon, and enemy fighters were already moving toward the crash site. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they found her. 10 minutes to hide, to evade, to survive long enough for rescue to arrive, if rescue was even coming. But as her boots touched the rocky ground and she began gathering her parachute, Katia heard something that made her smile despite the desperate nature of her situation. It was Morrison's voice on the survival radio, calling for immediate search and rescue. Any station, this is Viper 6-1. We have a pilot down, coordinates follow. This is a priority rescue. The pilot is Captain Mikhailova, and she just saved all our lives. For the first time in her career, someone was calling her by her real name instead of her call sign. And they were saying it with the kind of respect that no amount of political controversy could ever diminish. Katia found cover among the rocks and settled in to wait. Either rescue would come, or it wouldn't. Either she would survive the night, or she wouldn't. But somewhere in the darkness, 12 American warriors were making their way to safety, and that was all that mattered. The daughter of a Soviet defector had proven her loyalty in the most final way possible. Whatever happened next, no one would ever question where Captain Katia Mikhailova's heart truly belonged. 20 minutes after Katia's aircraft went down, the mountains erupted with activity. Not just Taliban fighters converging on the crash site, but American helicopters thundering through the valleys with the kind of speed that suggested someone, very important, had made rescue operations their personal priority. The lead aircraft was a Black Hawk carrying a combat search and rescue team, but it wasn't flying alone. 2 Apache gunships provided escort, their crews scanning for targets with the focused intensity of predators protecting their own. Staff Sergeant Martinez, back at Forward Operating Base Razor, was coordinating the rescue effort with the kind of controlled urgency that came from knowing lives hung in the balance. The radio traffic was intense, professional, and carried an undertone of something that might have been desperation. Rescue 1-1, this is Razor Control. Target area is heavily defended. Estimate 40 to 60 enemy combatants in the immediate vicinity of the crash site. Roger, Razor Control. We're tracking multiple heat signatures moving toward the pilot's last known position. Request immediate clearance for weapons free. The Apache pilots didn't wait for an official response. They could see enemy fighters closing in on Katia's position, and rules of engagement became academic when an American pilot was about to be captured or killed. The 30 chain gun on the lead Apache spoke first, its rounds walking across the mountainside with mechanical precision. Enemy fighters who had been advancing on Katia's hiding spot suddenly found themselves pinned down by accurate fire from above. But the rescue was complicated by terrain and enemy tactics. The Taliban had learned from previous operations, dispersing their forces and using the mountain's natural cover to avoid presenting easy targets. They were also communicating on multiple frequencies, coordinating their efforts to capture the American pilot before rescue could arrive. Katia, crouched behind a pile of boulders with her survival radio clutched in one hand and her sidearm in the other, could hear the battle developing around her. The distinctive sound of Apache rotors mixed with small arms fire and the occasional explosion as Hellfire missiles found their targets. Rescue 1-1, this is Survivor 1, she transmitted on the emergency frequency. I can hear you working the area. I'm mobile and moving toward your position. The response came immediately. Survivor 1, Rescue 1-1. Negative on movement at this time. Stay put and keep transmitting. We're working on clearing a landing zone. But staying put meant waiting for the enemy to find her, and Katia had never been good at waiting. She studied the terrain around her hiding spot, looking for a route that would take her away from the advancing Taliban fighters and toward the extraction point. The mountains were treacherous in daylight, potentially lethal in darkness. But she'd grown up reading stories of Soviet soldiers who had crossed similar terrain during the Soviet-Afghan War, and she understood that sometimes the most dangerous path was also the safest. Moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose rocks, Katia began working her way up the mountainside. Each step was calculated, each footfall placed with the precision of someone who understood that a single mistake could trigger an avalanche or send her tumbling into a crevasse. Behind her, the Apache gunships continued their deadly work, systematically eliminating enemy positions with the kind of thorough professionalism that left no doubt about their pilot's skill level. But for every Taliban fighter they killed, two more seemed to appear from hiding places carved into the rock. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter, transmitted from somewhere much closer than the extraction point. Rescue 1-1, this is Viper 6-1. We're 20 minutes out from your position and closing fast. The revelation that the SEALs were returning hit Katia like a physical blow. They should have been miles away by now, safely moving toward friendly lines instead of doubling back into danger. Viper 6-1, this is Survivor 1, she transmitted urgently. Negative, negative, do not approach this position. You have your orders to extract. Morrison's response carried the kind of flat finality that suggested the conversation was over. With all due respect, ma'am, we don't leave people behind. We're coming to get you. The SEALs weren't just coming back. They were bringing friends. The distinctive sound of additional helicopters reached Katia's ears, and she realized that someone had authorized a full-scale rescue operation involving multiple aircraft and probably half a battalion of ground troops. For a pilot who had been quietly shuffled aside by the Air Force, the response was overwhelming. But it also meant that dozens of American lives were now at risk because of her situation, and that thought was almost unbearable. She keyed her radio again, this time addressing the rescue coordinator directly. Rescue 1-1, Survivor 1. I appreciate the cavalry charge, but this is turning into a major operation. Too many people are at risk for one pilot. The response came from an unexpected source, a voice she recognized as belonging to Colonel Patricia Hayes, the wing commander who had officially grounded her 6 months ago. Survivor 1, this is Razor 6 Actual. Let me be perfectly clear about something, Captain. You may have been grounded by bureaucrats, but you're still one of my pilots, and I don't abandon my people. The words hit Katia harder than any enemy fire could have. Despite everything that had happened, despite the political controversy and the unofficial pressure to resign, her commander was claiming her as family. But the enemy wasn't going to wait for emotional moments to resolve themselves. Through her night vision scope, Katia could see Taliban fighters moving up the mountainside, following her trail with the persistence of hunting wolves. She had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached her position. The survival training she'd received years ago at the Air Force Academy came flooding back. Evade, hide, resist, escape. But evasion was becoming impossible in the confined space of the mountain valley, and there was nowhere left to hide. That left resistance and escape, and Katia had never been one to go quietly. She found a defensive position among the rocks that offered good fields of fire in multiple directions, and settled in to wait. The M9 Beretta pistol felt inadequate against the forces arrayed against her, but it was what she had. The first Taliban fighter appeared at the edge of her vision, moving carefully through the rocks about 50 meters below her position. He was followed by two more, then another small group approaching from a different angle. They were experienced, careful, coordinating their movements with hand signals that suggested military training. These weren't random insurgents. They were professional soldiers, probably Pakistani special forces or highly trained Taliban commandos. Katia let them get closer, waiting for a shot that would count. Ammunition was limited, and every round would have to find its target. When the closest fighter reached a position about 25 meters away, she squeezed the trigger. The M9 barked once, and the Taliban fighter dropped without a sound. His companions immediately took cover, scanning the rocks for the source of the gunshot. But Katia was already moving, changing position to avoid the return fire that would inevitably come. The rules of mountain warfare were simple: shoot and move, never stay in one place long enough to become a target. The enemy responded quickly, laying down suppressive fire that chipped rocks and sent sparks flying around her former position. They were professionals, all right, and they understood that she couldn't have moved far in the rocky terrain. A grenade explosion lit up the mountainside, close enough to shower Katia with stone fragments but not close enough to cause serious damage. They were probing, trying to flush her from cover so they could finish the job quickly. But quick solutions weren't available in terrain like this, and Katia had grown up hearing stories of Soviet soldiers who had held similar positions against Afghan mujahideen for hours at a time. If they wanted her, they were going to have to work for it. The second shot came when another fighter tried to flank her position by moving through a narrow gap between two boulders. Katia had anticipated the movement, and her bullet caught him center mass just as he emerged from cover. Two down, at least 8 more still moving toward her position. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of additional enemy vehicles arriving, bringing reinforcements that would turn her desperate last stand into a brief and ugly massacre. But she could also hear Apache rotors getting closer, and the distinctive sound of SEAL teams moving through the mountains with the kind of speed that only came from knowing exactly where they were going. The race was on, and Katia Mikhailova intended to hold her position until either rescue arrived or she ran out of ammunition. Given the tactical situation, both outcomes seemed equally likely. She chambered another round and waited for the next Taliban fighter to make his move. Whatever happened next, they would know they had been in a fight. The Apache gunships arrived like avenging angels, their rotors beating the thin mountain air as they established a combat air patrol around Katia's position. The 30 chain guns spoke with mechanical precision, walking destruction across the mountainside in calculated bursts that eliminated enemy positions with surgical accuracy. But the Taliban had prepared for this. As the helicopters engaged targets on the main approach routes, secondary teams emerged from concealed positions that had been specifically chosen to avoid helicopter engagement zones. These were the elite fighters, the ones who understood American tactics and had developed countermeasures. A shoulder-fired SAM streaked up from a position Katia couldn't see, its smoke trail visible against the star-filled sky as it tracked toward the lead Apache. The pilot reacted instantly, deploying chaff and flares while pulling into an evasive climb that pushed his aircraft to its performance limits. The missile missed, but barely. The explosion was close enough to rattle the helicopter's airframe and remind everyone involved that this was not a training exercise. Rescue 11, this is Apache lead. We've got active SAM sites in the area. Recommend immediate extraction before they get lucky. But immediate extraction required a clear landing zone, and there wasn't one available. The mountainside was too steep, too rocky, and too well defended for a traditional helicopter assault. The rescue would have to be improvised, dangerous, and probably spectacular. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter with a calm professionalism that suggested he'd been thinking about this problem for the last 20 minutes. Rescue 11, Viper 61. We have a plan, but it's going to require some creative flying. The SEALs had reached a position about 200 meters from Kadia's defensive position, moving through terrain that would have challenged mountain goats. They were carrying climbing equipment, demolition charges, and the kind of determination that came from owing someone their lives. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. The SEALs would climb to Kadia's position under cover of helicopter fire, then establish a repelling anchor that would allow them to extract her by fast rope directly to a hovering Black Hawk. It was the kind of operation that Special Operations Forces trained for, but hoped they'd never have to execute for real. Too many variables, too many ways for everything to go catastrophically wrong. But as Morrison and his team began their assault up the mountainside, Kadia realized that she wasn't just being rescued, she was being